The Moto Guzzi V9 Bobber is, to me, a lovely looking bike. So when they agreed to loan me one for a couple of weeks, I was looking forward to finding out whether that's all it is, just a posing machine, or is it a genuinely capable town bike that can also offer a bit of fun at the weekend. So let's start with the urban riding, and I've devised what I think is the ultimate test for a city motorcycle, and that is King's Cross at rush hour and then onto the Marylebone Road. The traffic is insane here, and that for me is a major requirement of a bike that you're going to use for commuting in and around town. The ability to get from A to B quickly, and in London or any other city probably, apart from in the States, apologies to you guys for not being able to filter, but that's going to mean cutting through the traffic, filtering and picking your way through stationary cars and all that kind of thing. And that's where I think the V9 Bobber has a bit of a competitive advantage. The natural competitors for a bike like this are probably the Triumph Bobber, and then maybe like Harley's Sportsters like the 883 or something like that. And yes, you get way more displacement with the Triumph, but this bike is just 199 kilos curb weight, which isn't particularly light when you set it against sports bikes and all those kinds of things, but it's 50 kilos lighter than the Triumph and 50 kilos lighter than a Sportster like the 883. That's a lot of weight. That's basically a small passenger. So essentially what you've got here is quite a nimble, agile little cruiser bobber type bike. And I've been riding it for a week or so in this kind of environment, and I've got to say, making progress through the traffic is great. I don't know if you remember your Mod 1 test, for anybody who did it, where you have to do the slow riding at 5 miles an hour, but I find that particularly easy on this bike. It's lightweight, it's easy to maneuver, and I don't know if the center of gravity is particularly low, but there's something about it that just means that walking speed, even if you're turning, picking between the cars, it feels very stable. And you might expect that 130mm wide front tyre on a 16-inch rim to be a bit of a handful, and you might need to muscle it around, but I think the width of the bars counteracts that. You've got plenty of leverage and it feels quite flickable. I know some of you might object to that comparison with the Triumph Bobber, because immediately when I posted a photo of this bike on Instagram saying that I had it out for test, a few people said, it's not really a bobber, is it? I can see their point. I would maybe more so see this as a Moto Guzzi interpretation of a bobber. And to be fair, you can remove the pillion seat with just one single nut under the rear mudguard, and then once you pull that out, it does look a lot more bobber-esque. But yeah, when I jumped on this bike, when I picked it up from the garage where Moto Guzzi keep their press bikes, immediately it felt familiar. It took me straight back to when I first got on the Triumph Bobber. The width of the bars, the fact that they're quite low and flat, the kind of bucket nature of the seat, it really cups you in there and you feel quite far forward. I think the foot pegs are maybe a little further back. This is definitely what I would call a mid position. They're not out front at all, but your legs definitely come down behind them when you're at a standstill and you put your feet down. Your arms and then your hips and knees all feel like they're at about 90 degrees, which is something that I remember from test riding the V85 TT, Moto Guzzi's classic enduro bike they called it. That was very comfortable as well, and it feels like a reasonably similar geometry. I mean, it's a similar motor as well, but I found it really comfy this week. A couple of other things that make it quite good for in and around traffic like this as well. The seat height 785mm. So as I said, you've got space, it feels comfortable, you're not cramped up, but it's still easily low enough to get both feet down for someone with relatively short legs like me. And if you have to waddle between cars and traffic, that can actually really help. And then also, it being a V-twin, it's got plenty of torque, a decent amount of torque, let's say, which means that if you're at the lights trying to get ahead of the traffic, or if you see a little gap that you just want to slot into, then it's got that power on tap. No real need to rev it hard unless you want maximum speed. So yeah, that's what I would call it, like almost a cruiser or bobber light. I think the other thing that makes a good town bike as well is something that's pretty practical, something you can just jump on, get to where you're going, and there's minimal fuss. And I've mentioned that the seat position for me is quite comfortable, and that helps for doing plenty of miles through the week in and around the traffic. But there's also a few nice little touches here and there. You've got a USB socket down on the headstock there, so if you're using your phone to navigate around the city, you can keep it charged up. Also, of course, it being a Moto Guzzi, it's shaft drive. Might not be a massive thing for everybody, but I do find it a bit inconvenient to try and keep on top of the chain, cleaning and lubing it in the winter. You've also got traction control and ABS. There's 2 modes of traction control, so dry and wet, and there's off. So if you consider off a mode, you could say it's 3. And those kinds of rider aids you might associate with faster riding or being on twisties and that kind of thing, but actually there's a lot of silt and dust on the roads here, and when it does rain, that means that you get a very greasy surface. So pulling away from lights with a torquey-ish motor like this, especially if you're pulling away and first onto a turn, traction control might just help you out, especially if you're commuting all the way through winter. There's also a decent amount of functionality to the digital display that's inside this. Oh, I wondered what that was. Thought it was coming from the bike. It's actually just a bagpiper. Yeah, there's a good amount of functionality despite it looking retro in a single small clock. They've kept it quite minimal and sleek there, which I like. But there's lots of information on the display there, so the usual clocks and whatnot, but fuel consumption, a couple of odometers, you can set a timer as well, and I think there's also an optional Bluetooth module, which means that you can connect to your phone and get ride data, additional ride data as well there. So the only thing I really can't understand about the display is, despite having like average fuel consumption, it doesn't have a fuel gauge. So for the £9,000 that you're paying for it, and the fact that it does have a digital readout there, you'd probably expect a fuel gauge. It has a warning light, but seems like something you would just expect anyway. And then last up for the city riding is riding with a passenger or a pillion. I've taken my wife on a couple of commutes. Sometimes we share the bike on the way in, sometimes she gets the tube, depends on the weather. But I gave her a lift yesterday and then asked her for her thoughts afterwards. And generally it's a really good bike. I've said that the pillion seat is removable with a single bolt, but don't let that make you think that it's, you know, an afterthought. It's really well cushioned. It's a nice squishy seat, which she said was good in terms of comfort. The shocks are preload adjustable as well, so you know you can adjust the sag of the bike and make sure that it still handles nicely with a passenger on board. But she said that that was comfortable as well. I've got some slightly sportier Hagen shocks on my Triumph Street Twin, which she doesn't particularly enjoy. So apparently this was much better in terms of cushiness. You've also got a little leather strap as well, which does help to have something to hang on to. Not quite as good as grab rails, I'd say, but still a nice inclusion. So overall, she said it was an 8 on 10 from the pillion's perspective. The only negative that marked it down, aside from not having grab rails, was the fact that it was raining a little bit the day before I gave her a lift, and the seat seems to have soaked up some of that water, and then when she sat on it, it kind of squeezed out of the seams. I think the fabric is waterproof, the seams aren't, and I got the same as well on the front. If you're garaging the bike and you don't really go out in the wet very much, then it's not a massive problem. But for me, if I'm leaving the bike parked outside the office in the day and it might get a bit wet, or I do the odd wet commute, it's not that nice the next day having to get a wet backside. So a couple of minor complaints aside, like the lack of fuel gauge and the occasional wet bum, I think it's a really good little mini cruiser for around town, both from the perspective of being nippy around the traffic, but also it's a pretty practical bike, good with a pillion. But do you know what else is good for nipping through traffic and for being practical? Like a 125 or a scooter. So what's the point in owning an 853cc motorcycle just for getting around London? The point is, you can get out at the weekend into Kent and Surrey and enjoy a country ride like this. Because for me, a good bike for my situation has to be a good commuter in the city in the week, and then something that you can have a little bit of fun on the weekend. Now, of course, getting out into the Kent countryside like this requires a little bit of motorway riding, and I find this bike particularly comfy for that kind of thing. My basis for comparison is my Triumph Street Twin, which granted only has 5 gears, which is pretty much the big limiting factor, but this bike, with the seating position and the motor purring along in 6th comfortably at 70 miles an hour, handles it really well. But once you get out into the countryside, on paper this is not necessarily a bike for the twisties. Sure, it's got 850cc, but it's only putting out 55 horsepower and I think about 62 newton meters of peak torque. I mean, to be fair, the braking's pretty good. It's a 4-pot Brembo caliper on a 320mm disc, but with it being a single disc at the front, you still have to be aware of its limitations. The suspension is KYB front and rear, and although it's reasonably firm, which is good because you're not wallowing around too much, it's not adjustable apart from preload at the rear, which is great for setting it up for a pillion or taking luggage. But in terms of that advanced rider experience, there's not that level of adjustability to dial in. And then of course, as we've already mentioned, there's that 130mm tyre on the front, which is never going to give you the most accurate, sporty feeling turn-in. So all round, if you're going to try and ride this bike like a sports bike on the country roads, you're probably not going to enjoy it. It doesn't like to be rushed. To get the most enjoyment out of riding this bike, I think you've just got to take it that little bit easier and focus on riding smooth. A few weeks ago, I tested the Zero DSR. For anyone who doesn't know, that's an electric motorcycle, and that's almost the exact opposite of this. You just twist the throttle and go, and there's not really any need to think about the nuances of it. There's no clutch, no gears, and I got a lot of comments on that video saying I'm not sure if I'd really enjoy riding a bike that, you know, you don't have that mechanicalness to it. And to an extent, I'd agree. I mean, I love the power and the torque and the way it delivers it, but there was a little bit less satisfaction from riding it. And despite the fact that you do have some modern electronics on this bike, like traction control and ABS, of course, underneath it all, it's still a pretty basic old school motorcycle. You've got an air-cooled V-twin. Oh, this is so much fun. With push rods and 2 valves. And it rattles and it wobbles and all that kind of thing. It makes a lot of noise. There's a single plate dry clutch as well. Now, the Moto Guzzi connoisseurs amongst you probably wouldn't even bat an eyelid at jumping on this bike and pulling away. But as I've said, my basis for comparison is the Triumph Street Twin, and that's got a nice light clutch. It's torque assist, so that means that the power of the motor pulls the clutch pack together, and that means that they can use lighter springs, so it's a very light action, and it's also a slipper. So if you let the clutch out a little bit too abruptly when you're downshifting, it's not going to punish you by locking up the back wheel. This just takes a little bit more concentration around town and also through the corners and that kind of thing if you want to get a smooth ride. And you could also argue the shaft drive. Now, I haven't found shaft jacking to be a massive problem. For anyone who's not ridden a shaft driven bike, shaft jacking is when you go on the throttle, it can sometimes make the rear end of the bike sit up. And a lot of modern shaft drive bikes like BMWs use a power lever to negate the effects. But this Moto Guzzi has none of that. Now, as I said, I haven't really noticed a great deal of that. But if you're going to ride it at a fair clip, if you're going to give it some welly coming out the corners, you need to be aware of how the machine is built and be in touch with it to get the most out of it. It needs a bit of skill, it needs some concentration, and it needs some time on the bike to get to know it before you can get the most out of it. And that's how it's an engaging ride. It's not the fastest bike, it's not a sports bike, but it's still a piece of machinery. That's definitely how you feel. You're operating a machine, not just flying along on a 100-mile-an-hour battery. Whoa, a bit of wobble on that gravel there. This is a great little lane. After a bit of time with the V9 bobber, I think I got a pretty good idea of who it's for. If you're looking for a bike with style and old school authenticity, but with a few modern touches of convenience, maybe you should try one out.